throughout the later Middle Ages and into the modern world, the power of the church remained undiminished, although with the rise of nation states and the rise of kings or princes for those nation states, not surprisingly, there was conflict between the church and the state over who people ought to listen to anytime there were disagreements. Not only that, there is the beginning of unrest within the church. We talked about the Lollards in English. We talked about John Huss and the Hussites in Bohemia. Both of these were people who didn't want to break off from the church, but wanted to see changes made within the church. For the Lollards, it was particularly a Bible in English, in the vernacular that people could study. And so for the first time now, we begin to see leaders within the church speaking out about church policies that they felt were unacceptable. The three real big issues that come to dominate the demand for church reform were, number one, nepotism, the appointment of members of the family by the Pope to positions of importance. Probably the low point of this is when one of the popes nominated his 14-year-old nephew to be a cardinal. That led an awful lot of people to question the way the church was using the power that it had. The second was simony. Simony was the sale of church offices. The truth is, because of the law of primogenitor, if you are the first son of a noble, then you are going to inherit all the titles, all of the privileges, all of the power. If you were the second, third sons, you had difficulty. They couldn't slice off the lower 40 and give them to you. And so the two places where you could take care of a second or third son, unless you could marry him off to a daughter of a wealthy person who didn't have any sons, and therefore the land would come through the daughter, was to buy him a position in the military or to buy him a position in the church. Obviously, what happens then is that wealthy people get all of the important jobs, the bishops and archbishops of the major cities where the money was found, and they got it without necessarily having any specific training in what they were doing. And the third, of course, were indulgences, the sale of indulgences, in order to ease people's time in purgatory. Good works on the earth would help speed you along. And one of those good works were financial donations to the church. Church was trying to build St. Peter's in Rome, trying to finish it. And they were more than willing to accept donations. Now, what came out of this, of course, was the argument that we would match donation up to indulgences. In essence, you could buy your way, or you could buy the way of somebody who had already died out of purgatory and get them into heaven a little quicker. It's this that ultimately spurred Martin Luther in 1517 to tack his 95 Theses on the door of the cathedral, if indeed he actually did that. We don't know for certain that he did. But again, Luther wasn't looking to destroy the church. Luther was looking to find somebody to debate him over whether or not this was a good policy or a bad policy. Eventually, the church declared Luther to be a heretic, and that kind of kicks off the Protestant Reformation. Luther gets a very good hearing, particularly among princes of the North German states. Now remember, there is no Germany in 1517. There's some 300 little states and city-states that are all joined together more or less in what's called the Holy Roman Empire, but they're all independent. And a number of these begin to listen to what Luther's saying. They buy into what Luther's saying, and out of this will come the beginnings of splitting the church into various denominations. Now, what we have to remember, of course, is that the Reformation frequently had less to do with religion than it did with politics. We miss that. I mean, Luther obviously was driven by theology. The North German princes generally weren't driven by theology. They were driven by two specific political concerns. For one thing, they had felt frustrated by the fact that the church from time to time would tell the people that lived in their states, don't listen to the ruler on this issue, listen to us. We're going to tell you something different. Well, if they follow Luther and break off from the church in Rome, then they're not going to have that anymore, because Luther was very clear in saying that on anything that has to do with the state, you listen to the ruler. On anything that has to do with theology, you listen to the church. And that separation of church and state that Luther preached was so different from what the church in Rome preached that it was attractive to many of the North German princes, who saw this as a way to get the church off their back. Moreover, the churches owned huge blocks of land in northern Germany. We talked about the fact that in France, at the time of the French Revolution in 1789, the church owned 20% of the arable land in the state of France. Well, it's pretty close to that in the German cities and German little nation states as well. And consequently, if we break from the church, then we also break from their monastic orders. We break from their estates. We can take all that land over. And as a prince, if we judiciously divvy that land out among our friends, then we make our people that much richer and that much more likely to follow what we want done rather than somebody else. And so these two things that have nothing to do with religion, they have to do with politics, become the driving force behind so much of North Germany buying into Luther's doctrine. The church fights back from the 1520s until eventually 1555, when the Peace of Augsburg is established. There is almost constant warfare. It's primarily the Spanish that come and fight on behalf of the church, and it's the North German princes that fight against them. But the Peace of Augsburg adopts the policy cuius regio eius religio, who's the region, his the religion, which in essence allows the princes to pick the religion for their state. And what happens in Germany is that almost all of northern Germany becomes Lutheran. Almost all of southern Germany remains Catholic. The impact of the Lutheran Church also extends heavily into Scandinavia, where it becomes the dominant religion there. Now in England, the Reformation, as it's called, has even less to do with religion. Then again, it has almost everything to do with politics. The British, before Luther, were strongly Catholic. They had followed the church, and there were calls for reform, as evidenced by Wycliffe. But the truth is, the reform was a reform of the church, not a destruction of the church. But the Reformation in England revolves around the character of Henry VIII. Now, if Henry VIII could have gotten what he wanted from the Pope, England would have remained Catholic. Henry VIII was a strong Catholic. He had either written or he had put his name on, because you never know who actually did the writing, a pamphlet called In Defense of the Seven Sacraments. Luther had argued that you don't need seven sacraments, all you need are two. And Henry had written that no, you need all seven. And the Pope, when this is published with Henry's name on it, calls him the defender of the faith. The problem, of course, was it goes back to the beginning of Henry's reign. Henry wasn't even supposed to be king of England. He's the second son of Henry VII. And so his older brother Arthur is the Prince of Wales. In order to secure a strong Catholic alliance, Henry VII marries Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, who is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Both good Catholic countries. Both were just beginning in the last part of the 1400s, early part of the 1500s, were just beginning to explore the possibility of overseas colonization. Spain is much ahead of England. In fact, after 1492, she has colonies in the New World. But England, because of John Cabot, sailing up and down the coast and claiming all of the land that he saw for Great Britain, the potential is there for them to be involved in colonization as well. Now, nothing happens until the last part of the 1500s, but there is at least that potential. And so the Pope is pleased too with this marriage between Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, because he can foresee two of his Catholic powers coming to blows with each other over questions that have nothing to do with what's going on in Europe. Unfortunately, of course, Arthur's 15 at the time that he and Catherine get married. And 20 weeks later, Arthur's dead. That means that the second son, Henry, is now going to become Henry VIII when his father dies. And it means that the alliance has the potential of going out the window. So what is argued is that Catherine now ought to marry her brother-in-law, ought to marry Henry. Catherine's 6 years older than Henry. But again, we're not talking about love. We're talking about dynasties, and it's a whole different world. And so what they did, what good Catholics would be expected to do, they went to the Pope and said, look, they're only married 20 weeks. The marriage was never consummated, and Catherine agreed that the marriage had not been consummated. And consequently, then we want Catherine to marry Henry VIII, or the boy who will become Henry VIII. The Pope agreed to this, and 5 years later, when he turns 17 and Catherine is 23, Henry VIII becomes King of England. Now, Catherine produced 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, only one of whom survived to adulthood, and that was Mary, her third child, I think. Now, this was a problem for Henry for 2 reasons. Number one, Henry had an eye for pretty young girls. He had taken a number of mistresses, which is not unusual in that day and age, and he had produced a number of illegitimate children, including an illegitimate son, who obviously would have been his heir had he been legitimate. But he really wanted a son, because the second thing that is true of Henry is that England had just come through the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses ends when his daddy, Henry VII, defeats the forces of Richard II at Bosworth Field, and then subsequently not only claims the crown for himself, he eliminates anybody else who has any claim at all to the throne. And so Henry is concerned that a woman simply was not strong enough to keep England together, that if he leaves only a female heir, England will degenerate back into civil war again. It was obviously the fact that one of his daughters, Elizabeth, reigned 45 years, that Victoria reigns 50 some odd years, and Queen Elizabeth II has reigned over 60 years, proves that Henry was wrong. But again, in terms of the time, Henry's ideas about women's inability to run the show was not necessarily unusual. And so Henry feels like he's got to do something to shore a male heir. Now he's really got two ways to do this. One, he could petition the Pope, Clement VII, to make his illegitimate son legitimate, which the Pope had the power to do. The other thing, of course, is he can get rid of his wife and marry one of these sweet young things that he has an eye for. And ultimately, Henry decides that Catherine is now 40. She's not going to produce any more children, male or female, for him. And so he goes, or his agents go to the Pope, go to Clement, and ask for an annulment. You can't get a divorce in the Catholic Church. You can get an annulment. Now, this would seem a little strange to us in 2020, but not unusual necessarily. Well, maybe unusual, but not unheard of for this era, for the Pope to grant an annulment, even though these people have been married for 17 years and she produced children. But the argument is that God obviously was punishing Catherine and Henry by not giving them a son when Henry had proved that he could produce sons. But that what that meant was that the marriage must have to Arthur must have been consummated, and therefore as brother-in-law, sister-in-law, and now married couple, they were living in sin. And so the argument is you have to annul this marriage because we're in sin, and we just can't live that way. And that puts Clement VII in a tough spot. Here you have a very powerful Catholic England. You have an equally powerful Catholic Spain that had been the shock troops in the battle with Luther and the Lutherans in Germany, and two good Catholic states. Which one are you going to offend? Catherine doesn't want to be divorced. Her nephew, who is now the King of Spain, doesn't want his aunt to be divorced. And so if you grant the divorce, you're going to offend the Spanish. If you don't grant the divorce, you're going to offend the English. And Clement, I guess, because Spain's a whole lot closer to Rome than England is, rules against what Henry wants. Well, if that happens, then Henry's left with one option. That is, declare the church in England to be the Church of England, with the monarch to be the head rather than the Pope. And Henry does that and is thus able to grant his own annulment and can marry Anne Boleyn in the hope that she will produce him a son. Now, obviously, none of that has anything to do with religion. It all has to do with politics. And if you look at the changes that come to the church in England, it's clear that this is not really what Henry wanted. He would much rather have remained Catholic. because the Church of England's service changed very little from Catholicism. The service, the Mass, was now in English and not in Latin, and of course Henry's the head of the church rather than the church being in the hands of the Pope. Other than that, you could still be Catholic, or so it seemed. So what happens over time is that eventually the same kind of opposition that arose against the church in Rome began to arise against the Church of England. People who felt like we really need to move further away from Catholicism than we have. We need to change the way we operate. We need to give more power to local congregations. We need to give them the right to call their ministers rather than them being appointed by some church hierarchy. We need to focus on other aspects of worship other than the ones that the Church of England is pushing. Now, the most famous of these dissenters, as they are known, of course, are the Puritans. They're the ones that we hear about a lot. The term Puritan means that they want to purify the church. They don't see themselves as moving away from the Church of England. They see themselves as making the Church of England better. The two groups of these that make some appearance in America, one, of course, are the Pilgrims. They arrive in 1620. They are what are called separatists. They want to separate from the Church of England, create a religious state that clearly God has blessed, and then be invited back to England because they are so successful and put their way of operating into the Church of England. The other group, 1629, founds Massachusetts Bay. They are non-separatists. They still considered themselves members of the Church of England, but they believed they had a better way of doing it. You know, there's an old statement, build a better mousetrap and the world will beat a path to your door. Well, they thought they had a better mousetrap, and they thought that when it became apparent that God was blessing them, that the people in England would recognize this and invite them back. The most famous of the works on the Puritans in America is by a guy named Perry Miller, called Errand into the Wilderness, because that's what they thought they were doing. You know, they were gonna put their light up on a stand for the whole world to see, and they were going to be so successful that they were going to be invited to take back over in England. And in fact, in 1640, in Great Britain, a civil war breaks out, a civil war in which Charles I's head will be cut off, and England will create a Puritan Commonwealth from 1648 to 1660. And it looked like the Puritans had won. The problem is they hadn't. Although Cromwell was able to run England, Cromwell's successors couldn't. And in 1660, the so-called restoration occurred. Charles XII is brought back, and the Church of England is brought back with all kinds of issues that will follow. Now, during the time all this is going on, another group of dissenters called the Religious Society of Friends, better known as the Quakers, makes its appearance in Great Britain. The term Quaker was a backhanded slap at the Religious Society of Friends, because in the spur of the moment, in the emotion of the moment, they sometimes were carried away by the Spirit, and would seem to quake as a part of their service. Much of the credit for the founding of the Quakers goes to a man named George Fox. Fox was the son of a wealthy weaver from the northern part of England. And he proves early on to be incredibly studious, a very powerful interpreter of the Bible. People wanted him to be a preacher. Instead, he apprentices with another artisan, and only moves to preach at a later time. His father, when he died, left him a good bequest, and consequently, he's able to pursue his interests in ways that others might not have been. And he begins to travel around. He begins to preach, despite his failure to follow preaching right out of from the very first, and to try to convince others of his beliefs. Quakers are unusual in terms of the time. They managed to offend everybody. The Puritans were a thorn in the side sometimes, but the Puritans believed they were members of the Church of England, and therefore maybe they get a little more, maybe people are more willing to put up with them than they might have been otherwise. But the Quakers reject the notion that there is such a thing as an ordained ministry. Nobody needed to be trained. Nobody needed to be licensed or certified to be a minister. And more to the point, in an era where unfortunately the lives of women weren't very positive, they believed that anybody had the right to speak. Anybody had the right to hear God's word, male or female. And consequently, they rejected the tradition that you read the Bible and somebody stands up in front of you and explains this to you. The Quakers accepted what they called the inner light, that God let God's self be known to any individual. And it didn't have to, you didn't have to be trained to hear or to feel the inner light. And so rather than formal worship services, Quakers had what they call meetings, and they would sit in a square where nobody was up in front. There's no altar. There's nobody in charge. And anybody who felt the Spirit move him or her was invited to stand up and say what the Spirit had revealed to them. It was and obviously this is where the emotion could come in. This is where the quaking could happen. There's a group called the Shaking Quakers, or in America they're known as the Shakers, who actually developed this to a formal service. The shaker dances and the songs are much more stylized than with the Quakers. But not only were they different in terms of the way they worshiped, they rejected alcohol. They didn't believe that anybody was better than anybody else. You know, there's a tradition in England that if you passed somebody who was better than you on the streets, you bowed to him, or if you were a man, you took off your hat. The Quakers weren't going to do that. They didn't believe in titles. They used the diminutive thee and thou and thine as a part of their worship. They refused to take any kind of oaths. That's a difficulty, because if you wanted to vote in England, if you wanted to play a part in politics, you had to take an oath that you were not a Catholic. Well, the Quakers obviously weren't Catholic, but they refused to take the oath, and therefore they were not allowed to participate in government. And maybe most interestingly, they refused to take up arms. They didn't believe that problems couldn't be solved by some way other than resorting to war and violence. Now, it's interesting that in America, some of our best generals were Quakers. Nathaniel Greene, who perhaps was the best subordinate general that George Washington had, was a Quaker. But for the most part, Quakers reject going to war. Well, that gets them in trouble. This is why nobody likes them, because again, people in other religions felt like you had to defend your faith, you had to defend your country, and if you're called into the army, you need to be there. And the Quakers weren't going to be there. They believed in living simply, with humility, abandon all luxury. This put them in bad stead with so many people in England. And Fox, in fact, spent a number of days and months in prison because of his belief. Now, we're generally a little more familiar with the Quakers than we are most of the other saints that we have talked about in this series. And the reason we have is because one of Fox's converts was William Penn. Penn's father was wealthy. He was a stalwart leader of the Church of England. He was, in fact, one of those people who had brought Charles II back at the time of the Restoration, and one of the strongest supporters of Charles II. Now, the problem, of course, is that when Penn becomes a Quaker, there is this issue that perhaps he's rejected his father and what his father wanted done, and his father did everything he could to bring his son back into what the father believed was right. He beat him unmercifully. He forced him to go to military school. Ironically, the best portrait we have of William Penn is taken in full military regalia. But eventually he recognized that this was a true commitment on his son, and he gave in. He was not happy, but he did give in. And at the time his father died, Penn, of course, inherits titles and positions. And so what he does is, recognizing that the Quakers need a haven in the New World. Now, the English were pretty remarkable. If you weren't Catholic, you couldn't live in a Spanish colony. If you weren't Catholic, you couldn't go to a French colony. In fact, when the French got rid of their Protestants, their Huguenots, they lost a lot of their middle class. Most of them went and lived in the Rhine River Valley in Germany. Some went to England. A few of them moved to the United States. The family of Paul Revere was Catholic. The family of John Jay, our first Chief Justice, was Huguenot. And they came to America. Revere was French. I'll get that right in a second. But many of them went to England, where some of them threw in with the Quakers. But the English were very good about letting religious dissenters come to their colonies, where they could still be English, but they could worship the way they wanted to. And so you get Maryland as a haven for Catholics. You get New England, which is a haven for Puritans. And you get, because of William Penn's request, he gets a grant of land from Charles II that becomes the area of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania grows rapidly. Quakers become powerful influences in America, particularly in the anti-slavery movement. Because of where Pennsylvania is, if you could make your way there as a fugitive slave, likelihood is you were going to find people that would help you stay independent, or free rather, or make your way on further north. Penn was remarkable as a marketing agent, and because of his ability to market, because of the fertility of the land, eventually Pennsylvania becomes not just a haven for Quakers, but one of the most important of the American colonies at the time of the outbreak of the American Revolution.